Let's go ahead and get started here. I want to thank everyone for joining me this evening for the Leaky Gut Solution. I'm looking forward to bringing this information to you. Hopefully I can bring a few points across that maybe you haven't heard from other sources, give you some different perspectives on things. I'd like to start off just quickly, if I can, just giving you a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. Arland Hill. I've been in practice of functional medicine for about the last 20 years now, and I've had the opportunity to work in various parts of this sector of the healthcare field and get to interact with a lot of different professionals in this space and get a lot of different insight from them. And so I'm going to try to pull that information in and pull that experience into the conversation tonight and share some points with you. I also wanted to let you know that I'm also the owner and operator, along with my wife, of Harvest Hills Ranch. And we use regenerative agricultural techniques to bring what we think is the most uncompromised food out there. We have a philosophy of complete transparency. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because part of this conversation tonight is going to be based around food. I think one of the fallacies a lot of times when we start talking about the nutrition world is that becomes a conversation around supplements, and that is definitely not the route that I want to steer us tonight. So I'm going to certainly bring food into the conversation as we move forward here. With that being said, let me start off by laying some foundation here and talking about the importance of the gastrointestinal tract. I think most of you would probably, if you had an interest in joining this presentation tonight, you would probably already have some semblance of what the importance of the GI tract is. But we have to really, when we're looking at it and talking about it, you have to understand that it's the gateway to the rest of the body. And when you think about what it is in the GI tract, we used to just have this mindset that it was a tube where things just move from one end to the other, some absorption from the food components you ate, but we really didn't have this understanding anywhere near what we do today, where we start talking about really having an ecosystem within our bodies that is built by bacteria. There's various fungus in there. We even have viruses, and many people will recognize that you can have parasites in there. And the thing that I think is interesting on these, people would think that when we start to talk about bacteria and fungus and parasites, and even viruses, that there would be a negative connotation around that. But there's beneficial roles here, of course, as well. Even in the fungi and the protozoa and the viruses, they have beneficial roles just like the bacteria do. So we have to think far beyond just this mindset of digestion. We have to look at this as an organ system that is really acting as the gateway to the rest of the body. And I think it's interesting now when we start talking about these connections, we hear things like the brain-gut axis and the gut-liver axis. And even when you start digging into this, you'll find things like the gut cardiovascular or the gut hormonal axes. And so really there's a relationship between the immune system, the hormonal system in the body, the vascular system. I mean, again, the effects here are far reaching. I always like to just draw a couple of statistics, not to bog us down on anything statistical of any great degree, but I think these are important because they really underscore the bigger picture of what we're illustrating here. And it's, the first one is that there's 10 times as much bacteria, or 10 times the amount of bacteria in the GI tract.
Yes. They just eat.
Let me just do this really quick, guys. Okay, so there's 10 times the amount of bacteria in the body as there are our own cells. So that really begins to underscore just how profound and how prolific these organisms are and what they're doing. When we look at the role of thinking about the gut as a site of production, many times we think about it as a site of absorption, but it's also a site of production. And one of the things that gets produced in the gut is serotonin. That's what many individuals will think about as the happy chemical in the brain. It's what makes us a social individual. It's what makes us want to, or makes us enjoy things, finding pleasure in things. That's all serotonin. Well, depending on the sources you read, you can find anywhere from 90 to 98% of the serotonin throughout the entire body is produced in the gastrointestinal tract. I mean, that's a significant contribution we're talking about there. And then if you just look at the immune system, 60 to 80% of the immune system is produced in the gut. Obviously, that's a relevant topic right now. So we can just easily make the extrapolation from that, that if we don't have good gut function, then we shouldn't expect to have good immune function either. So clearly there's this strong relationship between the gut and these other systems. Now, as the title implies on this for this presentation tonight, the leaky gut solution, we really can't delve into a solution until we understand what the problem is. And then we can begin to understand how to move forward with addressing that problem. So let me just go through and give a firm definition of what leaky gut is. Leaky gut's a bit of it's almost a bit of a comical term, I guess, in my mindset, because it really is almost so explanatory that you think it's too simple. But sometimes when you go to look for any type of credible information, you have to use different terminology to find scientific evidence to talk about this subject. And that terminology gets switched over a lot of times to what's known as intestinal hyperpermeability. And if you think about that, that would seem to imply that there is normally some permeability there, and there needs to be some permeability aspect to the gut for it to be able to optimally function. But it's this hyperpermeability that really becomes the issue. And that's where we can see the onset of major health problems begin to manifest, and even leading you down the road to things like autoimmunity, which is a massively growing concern out there in the healthcare arena. When you look at what exactly the intestinal hyperpermeability or the leaky gut really is, what it's saying is that the digestive tract is no longer to ensure that the things that should stay in the what we call the lumen or the central part of the gut, the things that should stay there ultimately do stay there, versus they are now able to be absorbed. And once they get absorbed, we're looking at things that literally many times are too large in size. So size can be a variable that starts to cause some problems. We can start to leak across things like different microbial components, where these microbes normally have a barrier that keeps them out in the GI tract. All of a sudden now they're starting to leak across. And this can even be a problem with, quote unquote, what we might think about as the good guys. They can start to turn into a problem in these types of situations as well. And as a byproduct of that, that's where you open the cascade to the chronic inflammation. And that's where now you start to see it segue into these other systems in the body, because as we now more firmly appreciate, there really is no chronic disease that doesn't have inflammation as some component to it. And so this becomes a key critical factor when we're starting to isolate where a possible source of inflammation might be. Now, let's talk about how the gut gets leaky, because there's generally not one thing that's associated with this. Typically what we're talking about here is a multifactorial type of situation. There's multiple factors that can negatively affect the gut. What I want to do is I want to give you some of the more prominent ones that are likely contributors. These are some of the things that when I'm having a discussion with someone, these are generally going to be at the top of my list. These are the things that I'm often considering for them. The first one, as you'll see in this graphic on the screen here, you've got this lady that is consuming what we would consider a part of the standard American diet. And that standard American diet does us no favors. I'll expound on that more on the next slide, but that certainly is a key culprit. We know that there's exposure to a lot of chemicals. Our environment has become a fairly toxic cesspool. I mean, it is literally toxins everywhere you turn, and we need to be aware of that, but we also need to understand that those toxins, just as detrimental as they are to us, they're also detrimental to the microbes in our gut as well. So we have to factor that into the equation. We can also look at chronic infections. Sometimes this can be a matter of what we might consider an overgrowth of organisms, not what we would define as an outright infection, but again, just an overgrowth of organisms. And then sometimes it does progress on into a true infectious type of situation that may linger into a chronic nature. And that can certainly lead us down a path towards a leaky gut. Gluten, some of the other grains, again, I'm going to expound on that one. There's other foods, and whether you develop an allergy or a sensitivity to these things, they can play a role. Medications are going to be a factor in this. And I would say one that gets easily overlooked here, but that is certainly a player for a lot of individuals, is going to be stress. And stress has been shown in a very, very short time frame to be able to start to change the profile of the microorganisms in the gastrointestinal tract. And that's huge, because that factor of stress begins to push the profile of these microbiota in a more negative inflammatory direction versus more of an anti-inflammatory type of direction. And so if you think about that, that really suggests that we need to mitigate our forms of stress. And a lot of times when I say that, many people will contextualize that as emotional stress. And that, of course, is one form of stress, but we can also look at and think about biochemical stressors. There's physical stressors that come into play, and we need to factor those in as well. Those certainly have big roles too. Now, let's expound on this standard American diet. Again, I'll have some things to say about different terminology that has entered into the conversation that truly underscores the state of where we are with our food. But when you look at the standard American diet, or the SAD diet, as it's often, the acronym is often used, it is absolutely one of the leading causes of chronic health issues. So this is not a topic that is by any means unique to, for example, leaky gut. I mean, we could literally have this conversation around the standard American diet for almost any chronic disease, but the impact that it has on the gut certainly exacerbates when we start talking about these other organ systems in the body. If you look at studies that now are literally over a decade old that show that upwards of 63% of the calories that individuals are consuming are coming from processed foods. I mean, that's a staggering amount, because you have to look at it as what's missing in that processed food, and what's missing is what is really going to govern what type of microbial profile you ultimately develop. So hang on to that comment. I'm going to give you specific examples on that coming up. If we look at some of the mindset around, or maybe some of the actions around the average person in the population, as far as diet goes, we've all heard the food pyramid. We've all seen the example of the food pyramid. Well, it seems like now when you look at this food pyramid, for the way the standard American diet lays out, it almost looks like grain is the base of the pyramid, and in the middle of the pyramid, you're going to have dairy in there. And then at the very top of the pyramid, you have sugar. And it just seems like that is the majority of what these foods are comprised of. So honestly, it's an area that really needs a lot of attention, and it certainly cannot be overlooked when we begin to talk about the health of the GI tract. Now, I told you that I wanted to introduce a concept to you. We know that many of these foods are what we might consider to be frankenfoods, if that's something you want to call it. So it's almost like it's a food-like substance. But there's a term that has begun to be used now that I think is even more illustrative, and that is, we've heard the term processed foods. This newer term that's being used now is ultra processed foods. So it literally illustrates the point that these foods are no longer really what we could even truly look at and classify as food. They're really more of a food-like substance. And if they don't represent true food and true nutrition, then they don't provide us, nor do they provide the microbiota, the key constituents that either one of us need to optimally function. And so as a byproduct of that, we begin to see the health of the microbiota falter. We begin to see the wrong types of microorganisms proliferate in the gastrointestinal tract. And when we look at where this ultimately goes, now this is where you start getting into the conversation of, I have to eliminate these overgrowths and chronic infections before I can realistically expect to see any improvement and real change in the gastrointestinal tract. You couple that with the allowance that, the FDA has really not done us a great service in this context, because they have not have not governed things in terms of having the oversight of what is allowed into our food supply that they really should have. For example, we know that there are literally now over 3,000 different food additives, preservatives, different coloring agents that have been allowed to creep into the food supply. And these are things that didn't go through the rigors of research to really validate that they were safe. And so that's a problem now, because literally what we've got is an influx of chemicals into our diet that don't have any natural metabolic pathway to work through. So they just literally become disruptive to our normal metabolic pathways. And we perceive that as disruptions in our energy production, maybe development of mental, brain fog, mental dysfunction. There's a lot of consequences and symptoms that arise as a byproduct of that. But here's where it gets tricky, is because a lot of times this road to these symptoms is a slow progression. It's not an event. It's not something that happens immediately. It continues to manifest over time. And so we cannot, I emphasize, cannot have a conversation about the gut without really talking about what type of food are we consuming. Now, let's talk a little bit more about being sick, about being inflamed, because it's this inflammation process that we probably misunderstand a bit, in that when we, in general, reflexively, when we hear inflammation, we put that in a negative context, as if inflammation is in and of itself bad. And what we all tend to overlook is that inflammation by design is actually part of our healing process. We use it to heal from injury. We use it to repair damaged tissues throughout the body. The real problem here, though, is the chronic, unrelenting inflammation. That's where the problem creeps in. And when that inflammation is persistent like that, that's where you begin to see bodily tissues break down. The body, for example, if there's a foreign invader that comes in, whether it's through an air passage or whether it's through a cut or whether it's through the gastrointestinal tract, if that foreign invader is not neutralized and dealt with, if it is allowed to persist for any length of time, it becomes stressful on the body over that length of time. And ultimately what begins to happen is that inflammatory cascade starts to build. And now we're beginning to recruit different elements of the immune system to build that inflammatory response. We really can't talk about inflammation and the immune system as two separate entities. Those truly are one and the same thing. They're just different aspects of it. But when we see that individuals have these ongoing, persistent, lasting episodes of tissue damage, for example, rheumatoid arthritis comes to mind for me on that. Obviously a common autoimmune condition, but we're looking at that chronicity of tissue damage that is playing out there. And so when we start talking about this leaky gut factor and how that plays in, that becomes that persistent source of inflammation that continues to precipitate this tissue damage that we're alluding to here. Now, let me get into gluten, and I'm going to have a few things here to say about gluten, but I want you to take away from this that it's really bigger than just gluten. There's really more to this conversation, and I'm going to fill in some areas here as we move forward. But it's not just about the protein of gluten. That in and of itself is a problem, but there are some things that we need to make sense out of around gluten before we just lay all the blame at the feet of gluten. So let's look at this for a moment here. Let me just state some important points here. One of which is that when we talk about gluten, understand that gluten is a bit of an umbrella term. It actually is the umbrella term. Most of the time when especially from a historical nature, when we've talked about gluten, it's been wheat, oats, barley, rye, but all grains by definition have gluten in them. So when you look at that term, it truly doesn't apply to just wheat or to just barley or rye. It's a bigger term than that. And it is interesting because the problem with gluten is that, especially when we go into talking about these processed and ultra processed foods, is that It literally gets slipped into everything. And I'll give you one thing that you can take away from the conversation tonight, and that is to say that when you look at your diet, one of the most critical things to implement in your diet is diversity. Not consuming the same foods all the time, not getting bogged down on what type of dietary pattern you consume, whether it's keto or paleo or low carb or any of the others, but diversity. And you can do diversity within the context of all of those different dietary strategies. But the problem with consuming a monotonous diet is that the more consistently the immune system, and again, remember in the gut, you're talking somewhere between 60 to 80% of the immune system, the more persistently your immune system sees and recognizes the same food, the greater the probability you're going to start reacting to that food. Now, take that into the conversation of gluten, where if there's the routine consumption of the processed foods, of which gluten is now incorporated into, or wheat, either way, is incorporated into the majority of those, now you've got a concern where you have greatly increased the exposure to that food substance, and now it has the possibility of really becoming an issue for you. One of the things that we have to talk about in relation to where gluten fits into the leaky gut, and the question pops up is, and this is a bit of the chicken or the egg crossing the road type, or which came first, the chicken or the egg type of scenario, is that, is gluten causing the leaky gut, or is leaky gut more of a, or is gluten more of an issue because of the leaky gut? Which one is really precipitating the other? And there's actually evidence for both. If the leaky gut's there, your probability for developing a response to gluten, and again, not just gluten, but other foods that are routinely consumed as well, has increased. But also, because of the inflammatory nature of gluten, it has the potential to as well contribute to the leaky gut type of scenario. So we have to look at that both ways, and understand that the complications can manifest both ways. How does gluten end up contributing problems? This is a multi-fold conversation as well, if you will, in that there's multiple effects that we can start to factor in here, aside from it contributing to the leaky gut and creating the inflammation and the other digestive distress, whether that's bloating, gas, cramping. It can cause a lot of GI symptoms. We also have to understand that there's an effect that takes place on the microbiota as well. And when you look at what the implications from this are ultimately going to be, we can start to think about things like digestion, literally the ability to break these foods down and extract the nutrients off of them, to get these foods down to a small enough size. That becomes impaired. The immune response becomes heightened. So now the immune system shifts into what we call a hypervigilant state. It becomes more aggressive. It has a tendency to want to react more fervently against things. It is going to develop a greater response typically when it does react. We can see that there's impairment in nutrient absorption that can certainly play a role here as well. Hormone regulation. This is a big one that gets overlooked a lot of times. We see a lot of interest out there in regulating hormones, producing enough hormones, and we want to appreciate that the GI tract plays a big role in that. In fact, there are a group of cells in the gut lining that are called enteroendocrine cells, and just translated differently, just simply stated as gastrointestinal hormonal cells is basically what that boils down to. But these enteroendocrine cells are going to have direct communication with the microbiota, and they are influenced by other hormones. For example, testosterone, thyroid, estrogen, all have effects on these cell types, which then in turn influence the activity in the GI tract as a whole. Vitamin production. This is a personal favorite of mine, because I always like to say that your microbiota are your workforce, but we want our workforce to actually show up and work. We can't just have them show up and not do anything. Well, part of their output each day is that they are producing things. For example, they're producing B vitamins, they're producing vitamin K. They produce all of the B vitamins. They produce what's known as conjugated linoleic acid, which has anti-inflammatory effects and is going to have a lot of individuals like to use this as a part of a weight loss effort. So there's a couple of amino acids that they produce that are going to be directly linked to the production of things like serotonin and dopamine. So now we're talking about not just vitamin production, but we're talking about the production of brain chemicals and the modulation of these brain chemicals being dependent upon the microbiota. But again, this gets stunted when we have these ill effects of gluten coming in. And again, I'm just using gluten as the example here because it's the one that most people know about, but it by no means is the only one that we could point to. We could point to a lot of these. There's also going to be effects from the microbiota on things like managing the mood. We know that in fact, one of the things that anytime someone comes to me with a psychiatric consideration, working on the GI tract and having an understanding of what the profile of the microbiota looks like is very critical because they have such profound influence over our neurological health. And even looking at eliminating the process of clearing toxicants out of the body, detoxification, if you will. The microbiota are going to be influential there. And so if we see that food substances that are coming in that are going to be stunting of the microbiota are a routine part of an individual's diet, not the occasional thing here or there, but the routine part of the diet, that's a problem. That's got to be eliminated, and we've got to incorporate in food substances that are going to build and allow the microbiota to proliferate in a more commensal pattern. Now, let me just touch on some primary, secondary effects of gluten. I won't belabor these points for you, but just some of the primary effects that you need to know about is that there can be negative implications on the barrier around the brain, that protective barrier, the blood-brain barrier around the brain. That's actually the same protein structures that make up your gut lining. It also, interestingly enough, makes up your lung lining. So when we start talking about leaky gut, we also have to bring into the conversation leaky brain and leaky lungs because of the same reasons. There's going to be that same inflammatory insult that can manifest, and this is a reason because this broad scope and these different regions in the body being affected. That's why you see the possibility of so many different autoimmune conditions manifesting. In fact, when we start talking about autoimmunity, and that's going to be a topic for down the road, that's going to be one I'm going to present on. So if you really have an interest in that, make sure you come back for that one. But when we talk about autoimmunity, there's 3 core criteria for autoimmunity. You have to have a genetic predisposition, which interestingly you can do something about. You have to have some type of environmental trigger. And the third piece is that you have to have an imbalance of the microorganisms in the gut, which are generally also going to be linked to the leaky gut profile or the hyperpermeability profile. Some of these other primary effects here, just continuing on with that, we can see some neuropsychiatric dysfunction linked to that, some functional dysfunction there. You can develop allergies, sensitivities, the allergies being the more immediate response, the sensitivities being the delayed, elongated responses that can be from time to time a little more difficult to isolate. The secondary effects that we can talk about here, this is where you get into things like your nutrient deficiencies. And one thing I'll share with you on this is the reason I make a point about these nutrient deficiencies, especially in the context of our conversation tonight, where we're really looking at these, not just the leaky gut itself, but the influential factors on it, like the microbiota. Many times an individual would think that if they want to influence the profile of the microbiota, if you want more probiotics or you want more active probiotics, then you might supplement a probiotic. And there certainly may be a role for that, and that does come into the equation. But I would also say that we should look at nutrients as a factor too, because we know that the nutrients directly influence the activity of the microbiota and just their sheer presence in number. For example, just off the top of my head, some things or ones that I know come to mind, things like glutamine, vitamin A, B12. These are going to be nutrients that are literally going to change the profile of the bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract even without the supplementation of a probiotic. Again, the probiotic may be necessary, but we also have to have those nutrients in place as well. And a deficiency can be a secondary effect of these problematic foods, again, gluten or otherwise here. We can see the systemic inflammation, and we do know again that that is far-reaching. So there's a number of secondary effects that we could potentially see when we start to talk about these problem foods. Now, as we lay out these problem foods path to disease, really where you want to start with this is that this, as you might even probably guess when we started talking about this disease, path to disease, it's actually pretty direct, if you will. The first step is the one that generally goes unnoticed. This is when most individuals don't perceive symptoms, and that tends to manifest or roll into where the symptoms are starting to show up, but they're a little more difficult to define, and to the point that they actually do become consistently problematic. And then they still may be hard to, from a conventional medical perspective, to put an actual fingerprint on and define those or name those, just because now we're still in that realm of dysfunction. When you look at how we continue to proceed forward on this, we see that as you consume that food, it's going to ultimately be directly interactive with the microbiota. It can be interactive with the immune system itself located in the gastrointestinal tract, and it can also, there's cells that are in your gut that are constantly sampling what is going through your gastrointestinal tract. And if those cells perceive that, whether it's gluten, another food, or an additive, some chemical that's found in these foods, whatever that sampling cell, what's called a dendritic cell, as that cell samples that and it takes it back to the immune system, if it is consistently sampling things that it deems problematic, that immune system response is going to heighten. And then from there, that just becomes systemic throughout the body. Now, I want to point out one thing about whether, again, it's gluten or some of these other foods that are part of the conventional agriculture model. And I would ask you to, rather than just always reflexively incriminating the food, maybe the real problem behind this is what is on those foods, what is actually introduced into the food supply at the field level, at the stage of actual production of that crop. And we see this with some chemicals that have gotten more attention of recent, for example, glyphosate or Roundup, glyphosate being that active component in Roundup. This has certainly got a lot more attention as it relates to responses to gluten. And it's by no means the only one. There's a lot of them out there. There's atrazine, there's 2,4-D. I mean, it still boggles my mind that literally you can walk into your home improvement store and anyone can just pick these up off the shelf and start spraying these all over their lawn, around their house. First rain comes by, it washes it in the gutter, and now it's in the water supply, and there's no way to get it out of the water supply because the municipalities don't have the chemical treatment facilities in place to be able to pull that stuff out. So now you have routine exposure to it. And so it just compounds from there. So we really have to be diligent about knowing not just about the food that we're consuming, but really having some understanding about how is that food grown, and does it make sense for me to choose a non-GMO or an organic option in some of these instances? And I think the answer you'll quickly find on that is that yes, it absolutely does. So this path to disease is pretty extensive. So some of the pesticides, so some of the points I was just making about this, let me give you a few other points on this that will further illustrate the point that I'm making here about this, is that there's 3 million tons of pesticides used worldwide each year, and 16,000 chemicals in production of these pesticides. So, and again, these things haven't undergone the rigors of research and trial. They've quite frankly been pushed into the marketplace because there's been money behind them to push them into the marketplace. So the dangers behind these are extensive. And again, it's not just about all the toxic effects that it's having on you. It's about how it's poisoning the microbiota as well and setting the stage for leaky gut. What you also want to know about this is that there are now direct links to various states of dysfunction, to actual disease states. So for example, when we talk about hormone imbalances, that correlation has been drawn, things like estrogen especially, but also thyroid. Type 2 diabetes, this is one that has definitely gotten a lot of attention when we start talking about these chemical components here. And it's always interesting to me because we look at something like type 2 diabetes, and we know that that is a blood sugar issue. And that's predominantly how we define it by. But you will find that no one that has type 2 diabetes is going to have a healthy gastrointestinal tract. If you have type 2 diabetes, you have a dysfunctional gastrointestinal tract. You have, at a minimum, some type of overgrowth of your microorganisms. You have a leaky gut profile. And without dealing with the leaky gut, you're continually creating inflammation that is exacerbating the dysfunction between the glucose and the insulin, as well as other glucose management systems in the body. So it's very critical to, when we start talking about these various diseases, that we have to expand the thought process of what it actually is that may be influencing these diseases. In the case of type 2 diabetes, we always looked at that. For the conventional model on that said, you need to change your diet and you need to exercise. You haven't been eating the right foods and you've been sedentary. Well, now the reality is maybe you haven't just been sedentary. Maybe you have chosen some of the wrong foods along the way, but there's also this chemical component that now we need to factor in. And we also need to understand how those things are influencing the health of your gastrointestinal tract, because lo and behold, that's an important variable in keeping stability of your glucose management systems as well. So these pesticides certainly have a long list of considerations we have to make around them. I can tell you, just to throw in a personal point on this, from a regenerative agricultural model, I run an entire ranch and with no chemicals anywhere on this ranch. I refuse to bring them onto this ranch. And we are able to have food production consistently, sometimes even still to the point that it boggles my mind how we produce such impressive food sometimes. So it's absolutely not necessary to have these things. It's just, it's the conventional model. But thankfully, there's a lot of opportunity now, a lot more interest in these, interest and availability of these non-toxic food sources than there certainly ever has been in the past. Let's talk about medications for a moment, because the thing I want to impress upon you with the medications is really around this idea of two things. First being that the medications in and of themselves can directly contribute to leaky gut. And the second being is that the application of these medications, the use of these medications, ultimately can lead to what are known as drug-induced nutrient deficiencies. Let me give you an example or two on this. For example, cholesterol-lowering medications. These are shown to deplete vitamin D. Vitamin D literally changes the profile of the microbiota in your gut. So if you have a vitamin D deficiency, we can say with certainty that you do not have an optimal profile of the microbiota, which means that you are now more predisposed to the development of a leaky gut type of pattern. So that we can say with confidence. The statins, the cholesterol, that group of cholesterol lowering medications, also lowers coenzyme Q10. So we need that coenzyme Q10 for energy production, not just in regards to, in general, how do we feel, but also when we talk about energy for various cell types in the body, of which the gut needs a significant amount of energy production, because you are literally turning over your gut every 3 to 7 days. Every 3 to 7 days, you get an entirely new gastrointestinal lining. So we need that availability of those nutrients, and we don't need the interference from those medications. And you can see from this example that I've used with you here that there's both a direct effect here, as well as there being an indirect effect on this as well. So that's one particular example. Let me also use acid reducing medications. This is a big one. Someone has reflux, heartburn, maybe they got some erosion in the esophagus there. They're put on acid reducers. Well, these acid reducers can affect the use of our proteins that we're consuming in our diet. They contribute to calcium deficiencies, B12 deficiencies. So there's a lot of implications around those as well that we should expect to see from routine use. It doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's times for these medications to come into the conversation, but they shouldn't be, there shouldn't be a dependency upon them, is the point on this. We have to understand what the implications are. And if they do need to stay in the equation, then action needs to be taken to compensate for those effects. So that's just how we have to think about it. Now, that's laying out the foundation for what the problem is. We defined the problem. We talked about the implications, what's leading you down the road to the development of the problem. Now let's get into the fun part of the conversation where we can start talking about how do we go about fixing these things? How do we go about addressing this dysfunction that we've defined here? And we want to talk about these 5 critical elements of healthy gut function. So let me give you these 5, and I'm going to give you these in an order of the outermost layer of defense. So this is, if you think in terms of these layers of going into the gastrointestinal tract, that's how I've defined these for you. So on the outer layer here, we have what's known as our mucosal immunoglobulin A. So there's a lot of different names for this. We can call this secretory IgA or SIgA. Really all this is it is a particular type of immune system protein that is found in the mucosal areas of the body. So we don't just find this in the gut, but there is a very, very heavy concentration of this in the gut. And this is what we're going to see is going to act as one of the first lines of defense of binding up these toxins. And these toxins can be from microorganisms, they can be environmental toxins, they can be coming in from the food supply. There's any number of toxins that we could be talking about here, but this is our first line of defense. It's going to start to bind those toxins up and begin to neutralize them. From there, we can lean into what are known as our tight junctions. Now, these tight junctions, think about 2 cells adjacent to each other, and then in between those cells is what we call the tight junction area. It's the gap, if you will, in between the cells. But this tight junction has proteins that push it apart. It has proteins that pull it back together, and there should be some normal movement on these tight junctions. But when these tight junctions become attacked, whether that is from an inflammatory insult, potentially a problematic bacteria or otherwise, literally these tight junctions begin to break down, and when they should normally close up, they're staying open. And this is where we get the terminology leaky gut, because it's this openness that is now allowing things to start to move through and reach areas on the backside of the gastrointestinal tract that it otherwise shouldn't be reaching. So that's the second. So we've got the immune system protein, we've got the tight junctions. The third critical element here that we need to think about is going to be our gut associated lymph tissue. This is what we call GALT, G-A-L-T, but this is literally the immune system tissue local in the gastrointestinal tract. And remember, 60 to 80% of that immune function systemically throughout the whole body is located and isolated in your gastrointestinal tract. So very critical to have that gut associated lymph tissue working for you. So that's 3. Number 4 is going to be our beneficial bacteria. Sometimes we'll hear this term, our probiotics, but I don't want to confuse that with a supplemental probiotic. So I'm going to use the terminology of our normal beneficial bacteria or commensal bacteria. These are the guys that we have a commensal relationship with. We give them things that they benefit from. They in turn give us things that we benefit from. So with these guys, they are constantly interacting with the nervous system, with the hormonal system, with the immune system. They're constantly feeding input into that system. And in turn, they're getting input back from those systems as well. So it's a 2-way communication that is on a routine basis, literally always taking place. And so we want to make sure that we have the right type of bacterial profile and that the wrong input is not making its way into the system. And then lastly, one of the last critical elements are going to be what I'm going to define as defense lines. And there's 3 different defense lines that we have in the upper gastrointestinal tract. There's going to be the acid in the stomach, there's going to be the enzymes from the pancreas, and there's going to be the bile from the liver gallbladder complex. All of these are going to have different roles in digestion, but equally important is the role that they have in acting as defense lines and preventing excessive amounts of microorganisms from making their way through the small intestine into the lower small intestine and then into the large intestine. This is where we run into these problems of overgrowth. And without these defense lines in place, you can almost be guaranteed that within short order, there's going to be some type of overgrowth situation in place. So those are very critical. Those are our 5 elements. Let me recap those before I move on here. We've got the immune system protein, what we call secretory IgA. We've got the tight junctions, the gaps between the cells in the gut. We want to keep those nice and tight and have the ability to move back and forth. You have the gut-associated lymph tissue, you have your commensal bacteria, and you have your defense lines in place. Now, let's talk about the treatment process, if you will, to deal with this. Again, this is the leaky gut solution. So let's talk about this from the perspective of a functional mindset. And when we're looking at this, again, as I've laid out for you here, this is a multifactorial type of situation. So there's not one thing we really can point to on this. There's multiple things that we can point to on this. So as you're beginning to think about how do I start checking things off of that list? Well, let me show you how you can begin to rule things out and begin to recognize actually where the problem is. So first of all, it's important to use some type of functional assessment that looks for nutrient deficiencies. We actually want to see not just if this nutrient is present in the blood or not. We want to more importantly see, is this nutrient being utilized by the cells? Is there an active reserve of these nutrients sitting in the cells? And we want to look at a large spectrum of nutrients because there's multiple nutrients that are going to impact the health of the gastrointestinal tract. There's multiple nutrients that are going to influence the production of these defense lines that I was discussing earlier. There's different nutrients that are going to impact the shaping and the profiling of the microbiota. So we need to know at a broad scale what the deficiency patterns are really shaping up to look like. So we want functional nutrient testing. We also want to, if you want to know what's going on with the GI tract, it only makes sense to go in and look specifically at where you deem a potential problem is. And the best way to go in and look at the gastrointestinal tract from a functional perspective is with stool testing. Now, we may think about things like if you want to look at what's going on in the GI tract, if you're going from looking at the upper portion of the GI tract, you do an endoscopy. If you're looking at the lower portion of the GI tract, you do a colonoscopy. And they have their place, but here's the problem with those things. Those are looking for gross abnormalities. They're not looking for microscopic issues. They're looking at macroscopic issues, big areas of inflammation. They're not profiling your microbiota to tell you whether it's heading and trending in the right direction or not. They're not looking at your ability to digest the food components that you're consuming. They're not going to tell you what the immunological nature, what type of immune response your GI tract systems are eliciting at any particular time. You have to look at stool tests for that type of information to really zero down on what is the functional needs of the gastrointestinal tract. In certain situations, we need to know about the toxicity profile. Are there chemicals? Are there additives? Does your history dictate that you've been exposed to these things? And if so, we need to know potentially what the cumulative burden of those things are and how they're impacting the restorative ability of the microbiota. And so that would come into play as well. And then maybe some secondary things we might start to look at, for example, doing some DNA testing. DNA testing, especially if you're on the fence about, hey, do I really need to cut that gluten out? Well, if you have a genetic susceptibility to it, that's a pretty definitive answer. And so sometimes genes really do help enlighten us on which direction to take the intervention protocol here. So we really want to look to some of these different functional interventions, functional assessment methods to understand what the dynamics are of what's going on in the GI tract. Now, let me talk about the functional 4, and this functional 4 has actually expanded from, there's really even more than this now. We have what we call the traditional 4R in terms of how you deal with what's going on in the gut. We want to remove things that are problematic. We want to we want to restore the microbiota that need to be replenished in that area. We want to repair any type of dysfunction that developed and any type of damage to the gastrointestinal lining, shut down these inflammatory pathways. And we want to replace things that are missing, for example, like these defense lines. But here's what I can tell you about all that. We've expounded. Those are all important, right? We still have to think in that terminology. We still need to think in terms of those as action steps. But I think we know enough now to say that if we only look at those 4, we might miss the mark on things. And this is what I mean by that. We have to re-educate the immune system. We have to help the immune system build tolerance to the things that it's being exposed to. We have to provide the things that are going to direct it not to be so overly reactive against what it's being exposed to. So that's one thing. We have to reprofile the microbiota. It just, again, I told you restore, right? Meaning restore the microbiota, put them back in there, use a probiotic, reintroduce them. But that's not enough anymore. You have to change the profile, because at the end of the day, when you look at a probiotic, and I know I'm coming across as anti-probiotic, and I'm really not. I just think that limiting our mindset of only using a probiotic misses the mark many times. And this is the reason, is that when you look at all of the different species of organisms, beneficial organisms, right? The normal beneficial organisms that should be there. Lactobacillus and Bifidobacter, which are the ones that you find in the probiotics, and sometimes Bacillus, depending on which one you're using. But those are the predominant ones. But they only make up a fraction of the microbiota, and they're not what we even deem as what we would call keystone species. Keystone species meaning the ones that absolutely have to be there in adequate quantities, and if they're not there, you can expect that there's going to be some dysfunction in and around the gastrointestinal tract. So we have to look beyond just that traditional restore mindset. There's a lot of other things that have to take place in addition to this functional 4 now that we just didn't know in yesteryear. Now we know these things, then we have to act on them, and we have to make sure that they're in check. Now, remove the bad. There's a lot of things that we could talk about around removing the bad. I mean, you could simply start at the SAD diet, but if you look at this particular illustration, you'll see that there's on the right side of the screen, you're going to see that we've got a lot of color there. We've got vegetables there. And this is an important thing to note, because you really have to put these back in. Yes, you want to remove the bad, but you have to put the right things back in. We don't want to just remove things and narrow down the diet. We want to expand the diet. That's the problem in the first place, is that typically the diet is too narrow and it's driving these states of chronic inflammation. And so if we can reintroduce foods that are nutritious, that are going to have digestive, that are going to be easy on the digestion, that are naturally going to have their own enzymes and vitamins and minerals and antioxidants, those are going to be the things that are going to in turn promote the building and recovery and repair of the microbiota, which ultimately the more stable they are, maybe what we would state as homeostatic that environment is, the more at ease that environment is, and the microbiota are, the less likelihood that you're going to be dealing with a leaky gut type of profile. They're going to help offset that. They are actually, as you consume in the right type of foods, they are actually using those foods to make components that are going to be beneficial to the cells that line the gastrointestinal tract. So they are in turn working for keeping the health of the gastrointestinal lining in check. Now, let's talk about some of the things that we can repair, restore, replace. I wanted to touch on this, and I'll elaborate on some of these a bit here, but nutrients must be replaced for effective healing. I think this is one of the things that when we talk about the gut, this is another one that sometimes doesn't yield enough attention, because we can look at, you need to remove things. You need to, maybe you want to put some oil of oregano in the mix, or some olive leaf extract to get things out of the environment, and then you put the probiotics in, but we didn't put the right nutrients in. We didn't put the things that are going to sustain us over a long period of time. Those have to be put back in for effective long-term healing. So here's just a rough list of some things that you would want to factor in. So at the top of the list, we're going to say things like probiotics and digestive enzymes, because those are the obvious things. But let's expound on that, because we need to talk about prebiotics. We need to talk about fiber sources. And this is what I'll tell you. And this is what I have consistently proven to myself over probably the last 2 years, or maybe even a little longer now, in working with patients, is that many times when it comes to building the health of the microbiota, if we select the right fiber sources and a diversity of fiber sources, and we incorporate in as much color in our diet as we can. So look at the illustration on the screen right here. You've got multiple colors on that image. You've got the purples, the greens, the yellows, the red. You've got fiber in every one of those food items on there. And the more fiber, the more color there is in the diet, those are the things that stimulate the health of the microbiota. And those, it's not just about, hey, you're consuming a good food. Yeah, you are consuming a good food, but what is it that that food is actually doing? And what it is doing is it is nourishing the health of the microbiota. If you can believe it, when you consume these colorful foods, they stimulate the activity of the microbiota, and these components, these constituents in these foods that we oftentimes consume them for and say, well, that's a healthy food because of this constituent in there. Would you believe that those constituents are actually made even more beneficial after the microbiota have the opportunity to act on them and manipulate them with some of their enzymes? So this goes back to underscore that commensal nature. It is not just about what the microbiota are doing, but it's also about the benefit that we're deriving from them as well. So it's that continual commensal activity. We know that things like collagen, turmeric is really a good example of a colorful component in the diet. Some of my favorites here that I often recommend, things like turmeric, green tea, quercetin, resveratrol, your berry extracts. You know, whether you're consuming those from a food component or whether you feel the need to pull those in supplementally, those are extremely critical in stimulating the activity of the microbiota. And again, these are only suggestions. Don't take these as I'm making supplemental recommendations to you here, but these are examples of the way the thought process needs to be in terms of what we can do to manipulate our gut. And listen, at the end of the day, none of us wants to take a pile of pills. So we all have to eat. So why not do as much work as we can and support our microbiota as much as we can, mitigate the effects and direction towards a leaky gut as much as we can with our diet, versus having to routinely use supplementation to do that. Supplementation is great for digging us out of holes that we find ourselves in sometimes, but it is not meant to be the basis or foundation for our health programs. So a couple of things when we start talking about the different supplements, I do want to make reference to things like vitamin A, glutamine, zinc. These are things, glutamine you hear about, but things like vitamin A and zinc, these are things that you don't hear about nowhere near to the extent that we really should hear about these things. So I just wanted to make a point about those particular ones. Those are ones that I find very beneficial in these types of support protocols that sometimes just, again, I just don't think get used enough. I think there's some hesitancy around using these, especially with vitamin A, because of concerns around toxicity, but for short durations, they can absolutely be game changers. And what about maintenance? I mean, let's be realistic about this. When we talk about maintaining the changes that you've made, that can for some be probably the most difficult stage of this whole process. Even if you build a strong foundation during the healing process, if you don't have that proper diet, the lifestyle choices, if the stress management becomes a hurdle for you, those are all things that can destroy the gut. So we want to make sure that as we're thinking through this, remember, this entire process, it's a process. It's not an event. You're taking continual lifelong steps. If you veer off a day or two, don't get sidetracked by that. You can get right back on. I do think it's interesting, as I said that, though, to give you some time frames, one of which is that when you talk about the creating dysfunction in the gastrointestinal tract, we can literally do that in 1 to 3 days. And the shortest time frames I've seen for rebuilding stability in the gastrointestinal tract was 14 days. So 1 to 3 to create the dysfunction, 2 weeks to get it back in check to really start to create some long-term balance there. So interesting discrepancy in numbers depending on which direction you're going. The guesswork on this, really, all this really boils down to is, I would say, when it comes to these things, trial and error is probably not the way to go with this. You really want some definitive, concrete things that you can point to know exactly what your particular gut profile is. Do you have inflammation that needs to be dealt with? Where's the inflammation originating from? It makes it so much easier than just trying to guess at what might be a likely cause of that. So I would say just eliminate the guesswork where you can. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you. You made it to the end of the presentation here. And I want to say thank you for sticking around, for taking the opportunity to learn this information. If there's certainly questions that you have, I'd certainly be interested in entertaining those for anyone. And by all means, if this is something that you're looking to take action on yourself, then by all means, all the best with the healing process here as you go through that process. If you're, I want to share 2 quick things with you before we pause for a moment. And that is, if you're looking for any additional information around me specifically or anything that I do, you can find that at drarlandhill.com. So drarlandhill.com. Or if you're interested in anything that we do out at the ranch, any of the food products that we have, any of the things that we produce that can be supportive of what we've talked about tonight, you can find that information and how to access our food by going to harvesthillsranch.com. So harvesthillsranch.com.